Betsy Corcoran. I'm co-founder of EdSearch, and I'm delighted to be here today with Matt Pittinsky, who has been CEO of Parchment and of so many other companies that we've known over the years, Blackboard, lots of others. He's going to talk about that. Matt and I have been talking about this session since, I don't know, February, January, I don't know, it seems like forever. And I'm pleased to tell you, as moderator, Matthew has agreed to answer all our questions. So we will not have any of the strange things that happened in other online conferences and debates that we have known and loved. The conversation that we have today is really around the business of higher ed. One of the things that is a fact of life are mergers and acquisitions. But as entrepreneurs, when do we think about that? When does it make sense? And most importantly, what does it ultimately wind up meaning for our customers? Those are some of the questions we're going to dive into. We welcome your input. So if you've got a question, throw it into the chat and hopefully we'll get to it. One of the points that I just wanted to make at the start was that when you look at the volume of M&A over the first half of this year, it was surprisingly, down about 13%. Yet a lot of business analysts are talking about how business activity in M&A is going to increase. And according to Berkeley Noise, which has done a wonderful job of chronicling this activity, the strategic M&A deals in the first half of this year in education were up more than 19% than they have been in the past. So clearly, strategic M&A has been a big deal. It's going to likely be a bigger deal. So Matt, you've been through this a couple of times. Tell us a little bit about when you as an entrepreneur started thinking about M&A, and was that when you should have been thinking about it, or should you have thought about it differently at a different point in the company's trajectory? And you can go into that from Parchment's point of view, or even from Blackboard's.
I think it makes even more sense with Blackboard. First off, it's a pleasure to be with you. And we talked, as you said, about this panel a long time ago. So I'm excited that it's here, and we'll cover lots of different dimensions on M&A, hopefully, from the company culture and how do you bring teams together to, as you've kicked off, kind of the roll and grow strategy. And I do think it's important to think about it from the perspective of a school or university, because so often they're using a system, they picked a particular partner, and then all of a sudden, from forces greater than themselves, now the system they've chosen, belongs to another company, and that has implications. But I love the question you started with. You gave me too much credit. I've only had 2 jobs, 3 if you include my brief academic career. I co-founded Blackboard, and now I'm CEO at Parchment. And we thought about M&A at Blackboard literally at the beginning. So the story of Blackboard is really the story of 2 organizations that merged together. Blackboard LLC started in 1997. That's when Mike Chasen and I started. And at roughly the same time, maybe a little earlier actually, a company called CourseInfo started by Steve Gilfus and Dan Kane and a great team of others out of Cornell University. And Blackboard Inc., that we all now think of, in the learning management space, really came to be when Blackboard LLC and CourseInfo merged. Mike and I had been able to sort of build an early business working with the IMS Standards Organization. We had a little bit of experience from our professional background in KPMG. We had been able to raise some capital with an angel investor. CourseInfo had built a first version of the product that we imagined we would build, but beat us to it, and had done it in the context of Cornell University. So they had that early user that could really be a wonderful reference. And actually, I think at the time, University of Pittsburgh, a few others were using CourseInfo as well. So you take this great entrepreneurial team and product and customer, merge it with whatever Mike and I provided at the time, and we were off to the races. Now, all of a sudden, we had a product, we had revenue, we had a bit of a leadership team, we had an investor. So the short and not so short answer to your question is, sometimes when you're starting, you assume the only path is to raise capital, kind of win the market organically. And you think of anyone who's trying to accomplish the same thing as competition, which they are, but sometimes they could actually be partners, and you could get to that endpoint so much faster if you brought the two organizations together.
So pause on that for a moment, because when you stand back, you can look at lots of different organizations and say, yeah, you guys are going after the same customers, you really ought to work together. And yet the number of times that particularly founders are willing to do that, are willing to kind of put aside their hopes, dreams, ambitions, and say, yeah, we're actually going to work together, is relatively small. So just pause for one moment and fess up. Were you guys a little nervous? Did you go into this with like, yeah, we can't wait to combine forces with you guys? Or was there a little more hesitation, and how did you get through that?
So I think it depends on what motivates you. So if your goal is to own 100% of the pie, then something like a merger early on as a catalyst to grow the company is less exciting. What if your goal is the mission? At the time, and I don't want to sound sappy about this, but at the time, we really were obsessed with the idea that there should be a thing like a learning management system. Not that we were the first, there was others out there like WebCT, but that this should exist, and it should exist in a particular way in terms of faculty-centric and easy to use, and any number of other attributes that we cared a lot about. And if that's your North Star, then it makes it a lot easier to imagine different pathways to make that happen than if your North Star is, I want to start a company, I want to own 100% of that company. Obviously, that becomes more complicated. So the piece that we were nervous about was just these new colleagues, because they were about to become co-founders of ours. And that's, I think, what made them nervous, what made us nervous. The only thing was chemistry. And would we get along? Would we have a shared vision? Could we trust each other? And so it took a little bit of time getting to know each other to take that leap.
So let's come back to the chemistry, but let's also jump ahead a little bit. Parchment is now also in this deal. Did you feel the same way? Did you think about that at the beginning of Parchment, or was there actually a different experience in that case?
So we have done acquisitions of Parchment. They're less the kind of mergers of equals that the early days of Blackboard and Course Info. So the dynamics are a little bit different. It's Parchment knocking on the door of everything from two brothers who created an awesome analytics site around undergraduate admissions chances to a more established company that was kind of a pioneer in e-transcripts in higher ed. It was a little bit larger in terms of the team and the customer base. So those were a different flavor of discussion. But even there, it started with, you're better at something than we are. You have a particular set of customers that we don't have that we think is really important to round out our network. Or you have a set of technologies that we haven't yet developed. And when you start with the humility of part of what's motivating the M&A is that the thing you are acquiring, almost by definition, has value. It's passed some gift test that you would want to buy it. Then if you can flip that to humility about the value that it's offering to you as the acquirer, I think the sincerity of that hopefully gets picked up by the seller. They feel valued, and you've got a basis to move forward. If it's about conquering and winning, then obviously that's a very different dynamic. And those, unfortunately, that does happen sometimes too.
So humility is not a word that has been in the public discourse very much in the last few years. Humility, that's a really interesting concept and a really important one. We've seen companies become intensely competitive, and very frequently companies wind up bashing their competition.
Yeah.
If you're an entrepreneur and you've been bashing your competition, how do you then turn around and seem humble enough to actually think about doing a partnership with them? Is it even possible?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's all about mindset, but oftentimes the companies that you are deeply engaged with as competitors in the market, you feel like you know them. You are sort of, chess playing against them. What comes out of that, perversely maybe because of the competitive context, is they're the ones that you have the most in common with, right? They're living the same market, the same products, the same customers, the same frustrations, and you very quickly realize that you do have a lot of common ground. And if you think about it, unless you're really dominating them, in which case, why are you buying? Then there's something that you could grudgingly acknowledge that makes them a challenging competitor, and that once you're on the same team. So I think back, to Blackboard, WebCT and Blackboard, I don't know if this is Coke and Pepsi, but these were two very competitive companies. Like there was a part of WebCT's culture that was existentially about, the contrast to Blackboard. And I will admit, I think the same thing was true about Blackboard. WebCT was actually in the market before Blackboard. Fast forward, the head of sales, and may have been president at the time, of WebCT, Peter Siegel, goes on to become president of Blackboard. Angel, the open source, e-learning platform, very competitive with Blackboard. The CEO of Angel, Ray Henderson, goes on to be president of Blackboard. So these things happen. Some of the best talent in the leadership, I think of Jessica Frinifrock, who came out of Prometheus, out of GW. So many of the critical leaders came out of direct competitors, and not just direct competitors who a big part of their message was being the anti-Blackboard. And it ultimately comes down to, yes, humility is part of it. It's just people. Like once you can find the time to get to know them at trade shows, in the context of the conversations around M&A, you realize they're probably motivated by similar things. Their offices look a little different, but we're all people. And we probably are doing what we're doing because we care about it.
Yeah. It may pay to be a little nicer to your competitors. It's kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Every entrepreneur that I mentor, when you're at EDUCAUSE, when you're at, for us, Acro, if you're not walking the exhibit hall, if you're not just reaching out and saying, can I get a cup of coffee with you on the side? First, you never know what you might learn, but it's not Machiavellian in that sense. But the worst that happens is you have a conversation, and then you might find out that you actually have a lot in common. There are some things that you could accomplish collectively, and you set the stage for an eventual M&A discussion because you built a relationship.
Terrific. If you're just joining us, we're talking about what it means to do M&A and when you should be thinking about M&A as an entrepreneur. Now, when you do a deal, you've got two major things you're trying to combine, right? One is technical, platforms, your tools, your products. And you've got to have this kind of come to Jesus moment where you sit down and say, all right, what do we keep and what do we give up? And then the second is people. Let's talk about both of those elements because they both have some real challenges. First, on the platform side, what have you learned through these deals about how to fairly evaluate? Again, here you are, two competitors with WebCT and Blackboard. You guys both believed in your platforms. How do you evaluate which pieces you keep, which ones you've got to go?
It's a great question. There's a whole technology dimension to that, which I don't feel, super qualified to speak to. What I would say from a process, again, it comes back to the intimacy of being competitors. Like I could tell you the three things that WebCT was better than Blackboard at. And I'd like to think that WebCT appreciated the three things. Blackboard was generally thought of as easier to use than WebCT. WebCT was generally thought of as more functional than instructionally grounded, perhaps, than that one I don't want to give away, but probably more instructionally grounded than Blackboard. And so that intimacy of competition, you deep down know where they're better than you, and you deep down, would like to believe that where you're better than them. And when you start with that basis from a feature set or functionality perspective, I think very clearly this notion of kind of taking the best from both becomes clear. Now, technically, that's a different question. Oftentimes, one system's a little bit older, has more technical debt, or one organization just had a larger engineering group and they're familiar with a particular tech stack. So there's more pragmatic considerations that are associated with that. But again, there's a certain intimacy in competition where once you can open your mind up to it, it becomes pretty clear. The one other thing I would say, and then we'll turn to people, is there is the third dimension, which is customer, which is the school and university. And a pretty large number of acquisitions actually happen, especially the large strategics, happen, with the mindset of, I'm able to take, this product that I'm buying and put it into my customer base. Or there are acquisitions like Parchment acquiring Avow, where we were strong in K-12, not as strong in higher ed yet. And so that was our ticket to getting a customer base that otherwise we would have had to take years to kind of build that level of credibility. So I think the customer is kind of the third leg of that stool.
And let's stick to customer just for a moment. We'll get to people, but you raised such a great point, particularly when you've had your sales force out there saying, that guy's product, you don't want that. What do you tell your sales force? How do they come around and the next week they're going, yeah, you know what? We're really excited. We're together now. We're going to do this. Yeah. How do they do that and maintain real credibility with their customers?
So sales teams are the most at risk of the sort of conquering, kind of syndrome of M&A. So you do have to work extra hard to drive that humility within the sales organization. Generally speaking, the context could be different where there's one clear winner and one clear loser, so to speak, from a product perspective. Usually the talk track to the market is, we're going to bring the best of both together. And the one thing every sales rep wants is, the best solution and the winning solution. So the conversation back to an institution that, I know last week I told you Parchment was superior to X for this reason. Now we're one company, turns out. It can be that actually, we've gotten to know them and we actually now are appreciating much better these 2 or 3 things that were really, strengths, and we're really excited about being the best of both to you. So that conversation, I don't think is as awkward as it might seem.
Let's talk about people for a moment, and then we have a great question from the audience, and we will get to that. And I do want to encourage people, if you have questions, put them in there, and we will take them. Talk about people. You've been doing the current M&A work that you've done during a pandemic. Is this a better or worse time to try to integrate 2 company cultures?
Yeah, so to set the context for those that may not know, the most recent M&A experience that at least I'm going through is our merger with a company called Credentials. So Credentials is a higher ed transcript services company, was a higher ed, transcript services company. Old Parchment, which is how we describe the former Parchment, was also a higher ed transcript services company along with K-12, and we support a broad set of credentials. And the 2 organizations have now merged. We've kept the name Parchment, but we really do view it as one new organization. And that's the first step. The first thing that I said to the team that I was getting to know most, which is the former Credentials team, is we're a new company. We're Parchment LLC. We are all co-founders of the business that we are building from here. And we have the opportunity to certainly draw on the traditions of both companies. And we carry the technical debt and the customer obligations and responsibilities and everything else of the 2 companies. But we really have the opportunity to create a net new organization that is more than the sum of its parts. Now, that is not a story you would tell if we were acquiring a small tuck-in. This really was more of a merger of equals, where that kind of a story. The pandemic, I have to say, in ways that, the pandemic is terrible, and I don't want to ever suggest that there's a good thing that comes out of the pandemic. But in ways that I never would have imagined, it has dramatically, I think, and maybe I'm naive, but accelerated the cultural and people integration. Because absent the pandemic, the former Credentials team would have gone to the office in Deerfield outside of Chicago the next day. Big Credentials logo up on the wall, same colleagues, same rhythm. And that would have represented us, right, from their mindset. And Old Parchment would be going to a distributed organization, but most people would be going to our Scottsdale office, big Parchment logo on the wall, same colleagues sitting next to them, and that would have described us. And then you get us and them, right? You've got one office relative to another office, I won't say verse, and you're only interacting primarily with the people you previously knew. That's just a hard thing to eventually get over. Pandemic hits, all of a sudden, no one's in any office. We're all working from home. We're all in Slack, and Slack was used by some teams, but not broadly across the company. I'm overusing this term. I don't usually use the word intimacy in a business context very often, but there's an intimacy to Slack where you're, showing your dog and your kids, and you're doing all this other stuff, right? So you're getting a human sense of people, which immediately humanizes, and people across the two former companies are commenting on that. And make a long story short, by breaking up the us and them that happens from offices and living in your routines, and by moving to an online environment that made it totally seamless for former teams to interact with each other and not even think about it. Again, it could be naive, although we've done some internal surveys that suggest this is the case. I think we have dramatically accelerated the cultural integrations of the companies.
So in other words, if you're merging two companies, you should do it entirely online.
Well, it is interesting to think about companies that don't have offices, how different that integration experience is from all that I've ever known, which is a company with one office, merging or acquiring, or more than one maybe.
Yeah.
But
all of your onboarding procedures, though, I mean, don't you have to kind of reinvent?
But even that's different, right? So, if there wasn't the pandemic, I would have, been on an airplane. I would have flown to Deerfield. I would have, spent 2 or 3 days in the office, and maybe some number of people would come in and have the courage to talk to me. And then eventually I have to go home. I have a family, I have kids, I have work. And what we did instead is I met every single person from the former credentials in groups of, I think, 3 to 5. And I did it over the course of 6 to 7 weeks, and with an hour and a half with each group. And that was more intense than it probably would have been otherwise.
You literally met every single person in Credential.
I mean, it's not like traumatic. It's 70 people at Credentials, but yeah,
right.
in small groups.
And how long did it take you, even with, let's say, some of the other deals that you've been involved with, how long do you think it took you to meet a, comparable number of people?
I don't think it would have happened. I think I would have visited. Yeah. There'd be a group of people that just by my role and their role, I would regularly interact with. Yeah. And then there would be a group of other people who would be in the audience for, a company-wide stand-up, but I wouldn't have had the same opportunity. Because the other weird thing about M&A is, like, we're used to getting a job by getting hired, or maybe a smaller number of people are used to getting a job by starting something. It's weird to end up in an organization because you were acquired, right? Like, that's just a weird thing. I didn't choose Parchment. And now all of a sudden I'm working for Parchment. And yeah, it's a free market and I could go out, but practically speaking, especially in a recession, that's not, the same dynamic. So I'm trying to connect this back to your question because that's what sparked it. So they didn't, so you have to be thoughtful that just as you onboard people in new hire, yeah, like M&A is a form of new hire, and then it's got its own unique. So that's where I was trying to go with it. So we were able to cover a lot of the things that we normally would have covered in new hire because of that ability to spend more time with people virtually.
Do you think that any of we should really kind of, well, let me take one step back. As you think about all of the M&A deals that you've been involved with, what were 1 or 2 of the real lessons that have been burned into you that maybe caught you off guard, things that you hadn't expected, those, surprises that we all encounter in the first 100 days of these kinds of deals? And then there is a brilliant follow-up question from an audience member, which is, are the lessons the same in K-12 as in higher ed? Do they all apply?
That's a great question. So thank you for asking it second, so I could try to think about it while speaking to the first. No, my brain's not that good. I think, we've talked about the first lesson, which really is just how important, especially for the, the leader, the CEO, and really, everybody, but you got to model it, is the importance of humility and the importance of appreciating the value of the other side, so to speak, and making that the foundation upon which you kind of build trust and a common culture. Never underestimate the power of saying that we wanted you. That's why you're here, is you were really wanted. Like, you built stuff of value and we needed it, and that's why we're all working together. And what I learned is that, generally speaking, I've never believed that, there's a light bulb moment and you're the one that comes up. It's mostly execution, not coming up with the idea. Lots of people have probably the same idea. And no one, there's such an immediate bond when coming together with another group of people who've been working on the same problem, in the same market and in the same way. So, that's a particular form of M&A, but so that's one. The other is, less of a kumbaya one, and it comes back to the customer. The right answer is the hardest answer when it comes to consolidating technology platforms. It is really, really
answers. Take a moment.
The hard answer is picking a system and migrating. And so what ends up happening is, oh gosh, I don't want to go tell that other customer base that they're going to have to move to X, or my customer base that they're going to have to move to Y. Because in fairness to the institution, this is something above them. They didn't choose this. Why should they have to all of a sudden resource a project, learn a new system? Like, every school and university has every right to be frustrated by the consequence of M&A, which is often either I have to change the system, or the system I have is changing, or now I'm just going to get told that my product is connected to some other product and the other product. So oftentimes it's to attach additional products and services. And hopefully, if it was done smart, it's something they actually wanted. Sometimes it's not done smart. And now all of a sudden, what they were perfectly happy with as a relationship around X problem, they're constantly being talked to about Y problem and Z problem, because the acquiring company needed to grow. And to do that, they needed to do acquisitions. But coming back to the core, you have to pick a platform, because nobody is served well by punting down into the future, running multiple systems, because you're just fragmenting your support team, you're fragmenting your engineering team. Inevitably, your sales team will have a conversation where the account says, can it do X? And you say, yeah, it can do X. Can it do Y? Yeah, it can do Y. The problem is it's one system that does X and it's the other system that does Y. And which one do we set them live on? So anyway, the hardest thing, because it's frustrating to the institution, but that's the right thing for the institution and for the organization, is to move quickly and upfront to aggressively get on one platform. There are better and worse ways to do it, but that's the other lesson, and it's a hard one.
Which kind of brings up the question then about the difference between K-12 and higher ed, potentially. So if a merger is ultimately going to spell change for the customer, regardless of how it gets done, it's going to spell big change. Is it harder to do that in K-12 than higher ed? At least in higher ed, you know who the IT folks are, and in K-12 it may be a little bit tougher. So is that the same? Is it different? Do you handle them differently?
Yeah, it's a different approach. The difference between K-12 and higher ed is scale. So, and for us, K-12, we're increasingly focused on the district, 13,000 districts or so, but we are still also very largely focused on individual high schools. We work at both levels. And there are just so many more high schools, right, than colleges. And the typical college is relatively big. The typical high school is very small. This is going to sound terrible. I don't actually think this way. But what it means is any one university can exert a level of pressure on what's going to happen and when more effectively than any single high school can. Because if ASU says, sorry, right, ASU is a pretty big account, whereas if Baldwin High School said, well, Baldwin High School is just Baldwin High School. I went to Baldwin High School, to be clear. So it's a great high school. So you tend to do change in K-12 at scale all at once. Like, we're upgrading the whole network. Whereas in higher ed, you would more likely take it in smaller chunks and cohorts. And in K-12, you're more likely to say, look, this is just the way it is. Whereas in higher ed, you're more likely to end up with a much more customized, or, you're more likely, it's more human scale. You're more likely to say, okay, here's 1,000 colleges. Let me talk about each of them, think about their configurations, and deal with it on a one-on-one basis. So maybe it's the difference between enterprise versus small business. So there's very big differences.
Yeah, I'm going to say that means that M&A is going to be tougher on your K-12 customers than it will be on your higher ed customers.
Change is tougher on K-12, but most things that make executing the M&A more difficult for the company is probably easier in K-12, because it's always easier to say to 7,000, we're going to all do it at once, than it is to go to 750 and say, we're going to do it one at a time. No. So I would say in that sense, it goes the other direction.
What's the thing that you regret the most about having done during an M&A process? You pick whichever one you want, but what's something that you're like, yeah, don't want to ever do that again?
Well, I have a bad habit in M&A, which is I get very excited about a prospect, engage, get more and more excited. And then there's always that moment. Sometimes you think it, often it's your engineering team that says it. We could build that. Like, it's not that special, right? We could build that. Mm-hmm. And, or give me another 2 quarters and I could sell that scale a customer. And then you start kind of second guessing it a little bit. And you have to, one of the things I do is upfront, say, this is why I'm doing it. This is the scorecard for what will make it successful. And that then keeps me honest for when, right? So yeah, you could build it, but are you really? Because you've already got 2 or 3 products and your engineering team is pretty oversubscribed for just that. And, time to market matters, right? And having an existing install base to reference. Education is a very reference-driven market. So it really makes a huge difference if you're introducing a product where you have 25 customers than if you're introducing the product, from ground zero. And sometimes M&A gives you those first 25 customers. So I don't know if that's an answer, but that tendency at some point to go through this curve of excitement giving way to, wait a minute, I only got a couple of bullets. I only have a couple of deals that I can do. Is this one really the right one? You start to second guess a little bit.
How many deals do you get excited about and then don't do?
So I'd like to think that I've learned. So early in Parchment, probably also because we started looking at M&A sooner than we should have in terms of the company's maturity to do it, to integrate and to scale. And you got to be ready to do M&A depending on the nature of the transaction. And so we did pull back from 2, I think, opportunities that were at term sheet stage. And I think I regret it in the sense that those are 2 organizations that I would love to be working with and have huge respect for. But it was actually the right decision because we would have bitten off more than we could have, chewed.
So let me come back to that question that we sort of started with, which is when should you be thinking about M&A? And I've now heard 2 answers. It depends on whether you're the sort of the M or the A, whether you're the one who's kind of expecting your organization is going to be absorbed, or you're kind of doing the absorption in an acquisition. Talk a little bit about, again, when should you think about these kinds of deals, depending on the size and the scale and the...
Yeah. So we talk about one, which is, I think it's up there with raising capital as a way to accelerate. So I think you should think about it in the early stages, especially if you're trying to create a new category. That's a lot of work. And if you can do that with another team, that's awesome. It comes in again when you've started to max out your original core product. And now you need to start building a broader product suite. And so, you think about it from that perspective. So those are the 2 that jump to mind on the kind of acquiring side of things, or merger of equals. When you commented about the amount of deals getting done, it feels to me like there is an acceleration right now with the pandemic. And I think it's because 2 things are equally true. If I'm a company, I think the pandemic is affecting some businesses in a very positive way and some businesses in a very negative way, and not many businesses in the middle. And so if it's affecting me very positively, then all of a sudden my numbers are looking great. And depending on where I am in my life cycle with my investors, now's the time to sell, right? Growth is accelerating, all sorts of good things are happening. Now's the time to sell. So counterintuitively, you're seeing businesses sell at times when the market theme would seem to play to their advantage to build. but it's precisely for that reason that they think they can get a premium and sell well. Obviously, the other is true, where there are businesses that are so negatively disrupted that they've reached the end of the road and they have to sell and find a lifeline. And then I think the third dynamic that is happening is there is sort of a Lion King kind of circle of life or something, where you've got these big private equity firms that maybe a year or two ago bought
A lot.
$100, $200, $300 million EdTech company. Part of their growth strategy was to go out and acquire, right? So you see EAB acquiring, you see others acquiring, and then you can go back to when Vista acquired EAB. So I think it also, you're seeing activity that is the kind of 1 year after a major buyout. And there are a number of those big strategics that are backed by financial sponsors that to drive growth need to do M&A. And so that's happening too.
Yeah, although interestingly enough, again, Berkeley Noise points out that the private equity volume fell by about half in the first half of this year.
Yeah, so I always wonder how that's counted, right? Because a lot of strategics are owned by financial sponsors, right? EAB is owned by a financial sponsor. Liaison is owned by a financial sponsor, so strategics and financial sponsor are oftentimes the same difference for a whole class of buyers.
We've got a couple more minutes. If anyone has one more question, put it in now. This is your chance. There's a truism in business that says you can always buy a company, but it's really hard to sell a company. How true is that truism? In other words,
I mean, obviously you have more control.
You made the point that there are some companies in the pandemic that are struggling a little bit. And from your point of view, saying, well, okay, I'm running out of runway, I better sell because I'm running out of time. How easy is it to do that?
I mean, that's certainly true, right? It's much easier to imagine yourself acquiring or merging than imagining yourself selling, depending on the context. So in that sense, it's harder. From a process perspective, I think it's easier to sell because you don't know anything better than your own company, right? So part of acquiring is getting to know a team, getting to know a company, asking the questions. You feel the risk of not asking the right questions and so on. Whereas if you're raising money or selling a business, that's a more comfortable process for most entrepreneurs in terms of the actual steps involved, right? Creating your deck, going out, telling your story, and so on. But certainly, it's a harder epiphany to decide it's time to sell than it is to decide it's time to buy.
And going back to that other counterintuitive point that you made a few minutes ago, which is if your company is actually doing well, if your numbers look really good, you said perversely this may be the time to sell, as opposed to time to do another raise. Talk through that dynamic a little bit, because if you were really doing well and you're hitting your numbers, couldn't you go back to your board and say, hey, let's double down?
Yeah, so I'm thinking in particular, again, you have to sort of map this out over a timeline. The typical hold period of a venture capitalist, the typical hold period of a larger private equity firm, those are not made up, they're real. And so if 5 years ago, there was which obviously through EdSurge, you know this very well, if 5 years ago, there was this huge spike in EdTech investments, lots of companies getting started and so on, it's 5 years later. So what I'm saying is on the margins, right? If you were within a year or two of starting to think about the exit, and all of a sudden the pandemic comes, your numbers are lifted, and you say, let's do it now. Certainly, to your point, if you're in year two, and your numbers are lifting, then you say, let's go out and raise more capital. And you certainly see that as well, right? With Course Hero and others taking advantage of the tailwinds in the market to raise additional capital.
By the time we get to the end of this year, give us a prediction. Do you think that we'll see, relatively speaking, a lot more consolidation, less, about the same as we normally see? Just make a prediction.
I mean, I'm not in the private equity world to see the deal flow, but everything that I'm told is that there's just a remarkable amount of deal flow going on right now. Just a lot of companies exploring strategic options on the sell side.
Yeah, okay, as well as strategic. Fantastic. So I've heard a couple of really good points. So I'm going to try to summarize them, and then you can tell me what we've left out. Number one is have some humility. Know your competition. You should know your competition. Go have a drink with them. Go meet them. And remember that they could be your new best friend. Who knows? Number two is if you're doing a deal, there's actually this weird element of like doing it online. Remember that you're kind of creating all of the different processes together. And so sometimes when you all have to change simultaneously, that may actually help the integration. A third point was communicate, communicate, communicate. This is so important, and it's never been more important now. And you've probably got to learn how to do that in lots of different places, including places like this and Zoom. And the fourth point is that the right answer is usually the hard answer, and that particularly when you're talking to your customers, you've got to make those hard choices. You got to make them quickly and go there. We now have a flurry of a few more last quick questions. What about the international scene? Do you see anything different going on the international scene than what we're seeing in the US from an M&A point of view?
The honest answer is I don't have a good scan of that landscape. Blackboard was global, but Parchment is more US centric at the moment in Canada, so more North America. So I don't have as good a sense.
And do we think this M&A boom keeps going forever, or does it?
I would say M&A, another context of M&A, right, is international expansion and looking for, there's another element of M&A and competition, which is, I don't know if it's the canary in the coal mine, but what better way to understand whether your product really does have a TAM and a relevance in other contexts around the world than to see competitors who are analogous to you be successful in those markets. So the international M&A becomes very important, both to scale internationally, but also before you're ready to scale, to show investors, look, I know by definition, Parchment, has an opportunity in Australia or in the UK or in the Netherlands, or in Brazil, because look at these, other companies that are successful. The other thing I'd very briefly say is the right answer is the hard answer is also true for people. It is often the case that unfortunately, not everybody at A and B end up, and that's hard, but it does no one any good to not make the difficult decisions up front to ensure that the combined company has the financial footing to invest in the team that's going to remain. And it also doesn't help anyone to have people who aren't bought in sticking around. And it doesn't help anyone to create made up roles because you feel bad when inevitably